In Wyoming, people still talk about the strange story of the tall Apache woman no one dared to court for 20 years. They said she was too big, too strong, too different to ever find happiness. What they did not know was that through those same 20 years, there were two Apache men quietly waiting for her. They had not left at the same time. They did not walk the same path. But in the winter of 1900, both of them came back. And that winter, Wyoming would witness a truth the town was in no way prepared to hear. That year, winter came early, cold and dim, as if it were hiding some great secret. On the western mountain ranges, the pine forests stood stiff in the wind, snow layering thick on their aging branches. The valley lay drowned in a pale gray mist, and the wind that slipped through the mountain gaps sounded like the whispers of long-gone years. Folks said a Wyoming winter always had its own way of calling old things back, the things that had never truly found an answer. In a lone log house near the edge of the forest, Nayeli was feeding the fire with old pieces of pine. The flames lit up her broad shoulders, her powerful arms, and a back as solid as the trunk of an ancient tree. She was so tall that the old wooden door had to be cut higher so she would not bump her head each time she stepped through. People in town usually looked away when her gaze passed over them. It was not because she was cruel. It was because she was nothing like what they were used to. An Apache woman, taller than every man around, muscles as firm as the stone in the mountains, hands that could lift a whole bundle of hay with one easy squeeze. They simply did not know how to face a person like that. Nayeli had grown used to their looks. 20 years was more than enough time for her heart to learn how to stand its ground. But no matter how they saw her, whenever night fell quiet and the wind moved over the roof, she still heard the running footsteps of her childhood inside her memory. Two Apache boys, each following her in his own way. One always ran ahead, turning back with a smile full of sunlight. That boy could make the whole prairie seem brighter. The other always walked a few steps behind her, but his eyes never left her back, not for a single moment. Those two boys were her entire childhood, two hearts that grew up beside her, then left Wyoming almost at the same time. The day they left, the wind was so strong, the sand rose and blurred the whole sky. Nayeli stood on a rise of earth and watched their figures fade among the hills. She was not yet old enough to understand why they would go without really saying goodbye. One said the tribe needed him. The other said he had to leave so his heart would stop hurting. She did not fully understand. She only knew those two paths had taken from her two precious things she had never even had the chance to name. 20 years passed, and she grew up in solitude. Every winter made her shoulders stronger. Every summer carved more strength into her arms. But the memories of those two Apache boys never once let go of her. Many nights she wondered where they might be now, how their faces had changed, and most of all, whether they remembered her at all. She had no idea that in the winter of 1900, not one but both of those men were on their way back. Each carried a waiting that had stretched across 2 decades, a love that refused to die, and a secret she herself had never thought to imagine. In the valley, crows began flying in dark flocks. The stream started to freeze, then thaw again in strange, unsettled rhythms. The old people in town said Wyoming was changing winds, and when the wind changed, some big story was always about to unfold. And this time, that story was headed straight toward Nayeli. On the first morning of December, snow fell lightly, like a dusting of white powder over the roofs of the small town. At the end of the main street stood an old saloon that had not changed its sign in years. Folks usually gathered there when the weather started to turn cold. That morning, when the leather curtain was pulled aside, the whole saloon suddenly fell silent. A man stepped in, tall and broad, nearly as high as the wooden posts holding up the ceiling. Road dust clung to his coat. His long hair curled slightly from the wind, and on his shoulder hung a worn leather bag. His face was sun-browned, his features strong and resolute. The old folks in town recognized him at once. It was Komen. The Apache boy, who had once been the fastest runner on the prairie, was now a man the snow itself seemed to part for when he walked by. No one greeted him. They only watched him from a distance, remembering what had happened between him and Naili when the three of them were young. That memory had lived in this town so long that people no longer knew whether to call it a story or just a piece of gossip. Yet everyone understood he had not come back for the winter snow or for some bit of work. He had come back for a reason that had stretched over 20 years. Komen ordered a glass of warm water instead of whiskey. He set his hand on the counter, his fingertips brushing a long old crack in the wood, as if he were touching a memory. He asked the barkeep a simple question. "Nayeli is still in the Eastern Valley?" The saloon keeper only nodded and looked down. He knew the past winters had been peaceful for far too long. He also knew peace never lasts when a big story begins to circle back. Komen left the saloon with a firm, steady stride. He was in no hurry. After 20 years, a few hours walking through snow meant nothing. The road to Naili's cabin crossed a wide stretch of land where the wind blew the hardest. But Komen did not bow his head against it. With every step, his stride grew more certain as the image of Nayeli's younger face returned to him. The girl with eyes like a dark lake and a rare smile that could blaze like a torch in the night. He had once loved her with a heart that was honest and burning, but that same boyish fire had driven him away when his feelings grew too big for him to face. By the time Komen neared Nayeli's cabin, the day had leaned into afternoon. A thin ribbon of smoke drifting up from the roof told him she was home. Komen stood there for a very long moment. He looked at the door, at the old hammer marks where they had raised the frame higher to fit her, at the path that showed only one set of large footprints. He pressed his lips together, drew in a deep breath, then lifted his hand and knocked. The low sound of his knocking echoed in the valley's silence. A moment later, the door opened. Nayeli appeared, her presence so striking it felt as if the mountains and trees themselves had drawn back in awe. She was taller than he remembered, much taller. Her shoulders broader, her arms more solid, every line of her face sharpened in the firelight behind her. But what made his heart seize was not that powerful body, it was her eyes. Her eyes were just as before, deep and still enough to make a person forget what they meant to say. Nayeli looked at him for a long time, as if she had to make certain the man in front of her was real. At last her voice rose, low and warm like the sound of night wind skimming over a lake. "Komen, it has been such a long time." Just those few words, yet they struck him as if the last 20 years had been nothing but one long sigh. Komen did not answer right away. He simply stood there looking at her, his eyes stirring with all the things he had never managed to say. Part of him wanted to say he was sorry. Another part wanted to tell her he had not forgotten her, not for a single day. But all those words caught in his throat, held back as if by the east wind itself. The two of them stood in the doorway for a long time. The wind lifted the snow in soft swirls around their feet. The sky dimmed bit by bit. In that moment, it felt as though the whole valley was holding its breath. The woman everyone believed would never know love was standing face to face with the man who had carried her heart away from this place 20 years ago. and Nayeli did not know that this was only the first homecoming. The second man was already very near, and when he appeared, the hearts of all three of them would no longer be whole the way they were in this fragile moment. That night, the wind changed. Gray bands of cloud pulled in from the Wind River Range, announcing that a snowstorm was on its way. Nayeli sat by the fire in her log cabin. Coleman sat across from her, looking a little unsure of himself, like a strong man who suddenly did not know where to put his hands when forced to sit face to face with his own past. The firelight shone across his features, bringing out the hard lines of a man who had spent many long years walking through dust and wind. Nayeli poured him a bowl of hot water. She did not say anything more. She knew there are stories you have to let time speak for first. Yet in that quiet air, she still felt something unfinished. Perhaps it was that familiar sense of absence she had known long ago, on the day she stood on a rise of earth and watched two Apache boys walk away. Even with Coleman sitting right in front of her, her heart still felt as if something was not yet complete. Coleman looked down at the bowl in his hands, then set it aside. He let out a long breath, one he had been holding for 20 years while he tried to keep everything locked inside. He said he had come back because winter had stirred too many things awake in him all at once. He said he had traveled across many lands, met many people, but nowhere had ever made him feel that he truly belonged. He said the name Nayeli had never faded from his long, wandering dreams. Those words made Nayeli's chest tighten, not because she did not want to hear them, but because she knew there were things far heavier than the word love. Outside, the wind began to rise. Snow drove past in heavy curls, slamming against the cabin walls like angry fists. In the roar of that wind, a different sound suddenly broke through. Hoofbeats, slow, heavy, and very clear. Nayeli stood up and walked to the door. She pulled it open, and through the wild white swirl of the snow, she saw a figure approach, riding through the storm as if the wind itself were pushing him in from some far-off place. That man was Tahoma. If Coleman carried with him the sunlight and raw life of the prairie, then Tahoma always carried the stillness of a mountain's shadow. When he swung down from his horse, snow piled across his shoulders, but his stance was steady, like the trunk of an old pine tree that had stood through many winters. His face was more hollowed than before, his eyes deeper, and inside them was some quiet pain that Nayeli recognized at once. She did not need to ask why he had come back. A man like Tahoma did not return for a small reason. He had come because his heart would not lie still any longer. Coleman stepped into the doorway just as Tahoma lifted his gaze. The two of them faced each other in the thick fall of snow. Two Apache men who had once played side by side as boys, who had once loved the same girl who grew up between them, now stood together again after 20 winters apart. But there was no boyish innocence left in their eyes, only the grave understanding of men who had carried the same long waiting inside them for many years. Nayeli looked at the two of them, and for a moment, it felt as if time rolled backward. The three Apache children they had once been rose up in her memory. Two boys standing on either side of her, each guarding her in his own way. Those boys had left at the same time, but their hearts had never truly left this valley. The strongest wind of the winter tore through the clearing. Snow struck the faces of all three of them. None of them turned away. Each one stood firm, as if their whole lives had been leading them to this single moment. Not a word was spoken, yet the Wyoming Valley understood very well. At last, after 20 years, the story that had never really ended was opening again. Three hearts had been waiting for the same person, and Nayeli was the only one who did not yet know that this was about to change everything. That night, the lights in Nayeli's cabin burned for many long hours. Outside, the wind still howled in long, tearing gusts, but inside was the warmth of three people who had once grown up side by side. Nayeli brewed a pot of hot tea. She set 3 cups on the table, then sat down, her large hands moving gently, as if she were afraid of waking something fragile between them. Komen sat on one side, Tahoma on the other. The 2 Apache men did not resemble each other, but in both of them she saw the same thing: a lasting weariness, a waiting buried under many quiet years, and a particular kind of heartache each man tried to hide in his own way. Tahoma's appearance did not stir the old flare of anger in Komen the way it would have when they were young, and Komen's presence in her home did not make Tahoma retreat. They only sat there silent and tense, like the surface of a lake just before a storm. Nayeli poured the tea. Warmth slowly seeped into their hands, hands that had already endured many cold winters. She looked at the 2 of them and let out a soft breath. For 20 years, she had thought she had grown used to solitude. But now, with both of them sitting in front of her, every feeling she had ever buried returned, so strong that her chest felt heavy. She asked Tahoma why he had come back. He did not answer right away. He lifted the cup of tea, letting the steam rise over a face still numb from a long journey through the cold. Then he said he had returned because he heard that Nayeli had been living alone for far too long. He said that on distant nights in faraway lands, he would dream of her standing alone in a snowstorm, with no one at her side. He said his heart would not allow that to go on. Those words drifted through the cabin like an old wind turning back, and Nayeli felt something deep inside her tremble. Komen looked at Tahoma, then turned his gaze away. His hand brushed the leather bag that had followed him for so many years. At last he said that he too had come back for the same reason. He did not say straight out that he loved Nayeli, but it was written so clearly in his eyes that he did not need the word. Nayeli lowered her head. She knew this was not simply a story of 2 men returning. This was 2 lines of time, 2 currents of feeling, 2 pieces of childhood weaving together once more. The room sank into a long, heavy silence. Outside, snow beat against the door. The oil lamp flickered with every thread of wind that slipped through the wooden walls. That night, many things began to take shape that all 3 of them had once been afraid to face. Nayeli placed her hands on the table, those strong hands now trembling just a little. Not from the cold, from the truth drawing nearer. She said that the 2 of them had left in the same year, leaving behind a nameless emptiness inside her. She said she had grown up without ever realizing her heart had once been big enough to wait for them. At those words, Tahoma's face tilted down a bit. Komen stilled, as if struck right in an old memory. Nayeli lifted her head. Her dark eyes shone in the firelight. She said she did not blame either of them, but she did not know what to do with the 2 hearts now standing before her. The men fell silent. They looked at her as if only now realizing she was not just large in body, but also towering in the way she endured and in the way she loved. After a while, Komen laid his hand flat on the table. He said he had loved Nayeli since they were children. He said he had run after her because she made the whole prairie come alive. Then Tahoma said that he too had loved Nayeli, ever since the first day she touched his shoulder during a rainstorm. Both confessions were spoken softly, yet the weight of them piled on all 3 like a mountain. Nayeli closed her eyes. She knew this moment would come sooner or later. 20 years of waiting could not be resolved with a single pot of tea in an old cabin, and she knew that tomorrow morning would not be peaceful. The wind seemed to know it too, because suddenly it rose, making the flame in the oil lamp tilt and sway. The small cabin in the Wyoming Valley had seen many winters, but never one that brought such a difficult question. How can a heart choose only one when both men are woven so deeply into the memories of her life? And while she still did not know what to do, something else was already unfolding quietly, beyond the reach of all three. The greatest snowstorm of the winter was moving in, and it would soon pull them into a trial none of them could have imagined. The fiercest snowstorm of the winter fell on Wyoming as if the whole sky had decided to come down at once. The wind was so strong it could shove back even the strongest men in town. The windows of Nayeli's cabin rattled in long, trembling bursts. On the roof, the snow lay so heavy that one more layer might be enough to bring it crashing in. The log house in the valley had stood firm through so many years, so many winters. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was because inside that house, three hearts were full of storms that matched the one raging outside. When the wind slammed harder against the walls, Nayeli stood to put more wood on the fire. A sharp, wrong kind of cracking sound came from above. She looked up at the ceiling and knew at once what was about to happen. She shouted a warning, and in that very instant, a section of the roof gave way with a heavy, splintering crash. Komen lunged toward her. Tahoma rushed to brace a tilting support beam. The whole house shuddered as if it might drop to its knees before the snowstorm's strength. Through the blur of falling dust and splintered wood, Nayeli saw Tahoma holding up a massive beam with his bare hands. But the force pressing down on it was no small thing. The wood began to slip. Without thinking, she threw herself forward, her broad shoulders and powerful arms taking the weight of the beam that felt as heavy as stone. In that instant, both men saw again the image of the young Apache girl who used to shield them from the high prairie winds when they were small. Nayeli had always been the one who stood her ground. Komen ran to her side and helped her hold the beam in place. Tahoma poured every last bit of strength into lifting the broken frame back where it belonged. The three of them worked together, fighting for the house as if they were fighting for a shared memory that could not be allowed to fall. Their breath mingled in the freezing air. Together, their combined strength pushed the beam back into position. When at last the frame settled and held, all three stepped back, gasping for breath. Their faces were smeared with sawdust and sweat, but in their eyes there was the same bright look. They had just saved this roof together, and in some quiet way, they had saved something long lost between them. Near dawn, the storm began to soften. The wind retreated like some worn-out beast. The snow stopped falling, and the valley lay under a deep, white blanket that was strangely peaceful. Inside the cabin, with the sharp scent of fresh wood still in the air, the three of them sat by the fire, taking turns nodding off from sheer exhaustion. When the first light slipped through the doorway, Tahoma woke. He watched Nayeli sleeping on her side, her large arms wrapped around a thick blanket. He saw Komen asleep with his back against the wall, black hair falling over his forehead. In that quiet, Tahoma understood something he had been avoiding for 20 years. He and Komen were no longer boys fighting for every scrap of attention. They were two grown men, and the heart they both turned toward was not a prize to be won, but a heart that deserved to be honored by their grown selves. When Komen woke afterward, he felt much the same. The two men looked at each other for a long time, not to measure who was stronger, not to judge who deserved more, but to accept something gentler. The love of childhood was no longer a race run by boys. It had become a choice for people who had already walked through half a lifetime. Nayeli woke last. She saw the two of them sitting by the fire, each holding his own quiet space. She smiled, a small smile, warm and true. She said they had saved her house, but really, they had saved each other. The two men looked at her, then looked at one another again. In that look, there was no more rivalry, only acceptance. They had not come back to fight over her. They had come back to stand with her and rebuild what was worth keeping. That day, in the rare thin sunlight of winter, the three of them began repairing the roof. No one talked much. No one brought up the question of choosing. No one asked who would be the one to stay. They mended the house with steady hammer blows, as if they were quietly rewriting a story that fate had left unfinished 20 years before. In Wyoming, they still say the winter of 1900 was the first winter when that large Apache woman finally stepped out from the shadow of her own mountain. And when she did, the two men stood on either side of her, as if they had always belonged there. They say she found her happiness not by choosing one and leaving the other behind, but by allowing both hearts to walk into her life in a way no one else needed to understand. People call that story strange, but anyone who has ever loved deeply knows better. There are some hearts that cannot be divided. They can only grow wide enough to hold all that they have been waiting for, all their lives. In Wyoming, there are winters that seem meant only to bury the land in snow. Yet in truth, they uncover the things people have tried to hide for a whole lifetime. Nayeli, Komen, and Tahoma do not need anyone to fully understand their story. They only need to know that after 20 long years, the hearts of all three finally found a place to rest. In a log cabin in a white, silent valley, they learned something the West has always tried to teach those willing to listen. That happiness is not what we keep only for ourselves. It is what we are willing to share, with a heart wide enough to let others in. And sometimes, winter can become the warmest season of a person's life. If this story brought someone from your past to mind, or simply helped you feel a little more at peace, please subscribe to Tales from the Wild West. Leave a comment, and ring the bell so you can ride along with me through more gentle stories of the West, where every heart has a place to come home to.